A racist security officer brazenly insulted a black soldier simply because he dared to wear his uniform with pride after returning from the battlefield. The officer could not accept a black soldier representing the honor and pride of the military. However, just 7 minutes later, that abusive individual was immediately fired. What caused him to fall so quickly? And why did this incident ignite an unprecedented wave of outrage? Subscribe to the channel now to not miss such shocking and meaningful stories. Sergeant David Thompson, a veteran black soldier, had just returned after 6 months of combat in a dangerous war zone overseas. Throughout his mission, David faced countless dangers and hardships, but the one thing he always looked forward to was the moment he would see his family again. During the long months away from home, David dreamed of a peaceful return, where he could hug his mother, share a simple meal, and sleep in his familiar bed. Today, he stood at Boston International Airport, carrying an old military backpack and his military ID hanging around his neck. David's footsteps seemed lighter, his tired eyes filled with hope. Nothing could ruin this special day. At least, that's what he thought. David approached the security checkpoint like any other passenger. The line was long, the chatter of people blending with the sound of loudspeaker announcements about flights. He removed his shoes, took off his jacket, and placed his backpack on the conveyor belt. Everything proceeded as usual until, "Hey you, stop right there." A sharp voice cut through the calm moment. David turned his head, his eyes meeting Officer Robert Harris, a security officer with a cold face and scrutinizing eyes. Harris, known around the airport for his racial prejudices, stood with his arms crossed, staring straight at David. "What are you doing here?" Harris asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. David furrowed his brow slightly but maintained his composure. He stood tall and responded calmly. "I just returned from my deployment. I'm just trying to get home." But that answer didn't satisfy Harris. He stepped closer, his gaze probing as if searching for something wrong. "Returned from deployment," Harris repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "I don't think someone like you could be on any mission. Where are you coming from?" Those words cut like a sharp blade, but David retained the calm demeanor of a soldier. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and answering wouldn't change the prejudice in Harris's eyes. "I already told you. I returned from a deployment. I don't want any trouble. I just want to go home," David replied, his eyes showing a quiet patience. Harris scoffed, his eyes filled with suspicion as if he was deliberately provoking something. "Random check," Harris said, though his tone was threatening. "Step over here. I need a closer inspection." David let out a soft sigh, his eyes scanning the airport. Hundreds of people were moving around, yet no one seemed to notice this odd situation. Silently, he stepped to the side, complying without protest, though a growing discomfort had begun to creep into his heart. Something wasn't right here. In the distance, another officer, Lisa Parker, stood watching the scene unfold. She observed everything but remained silent, hesitating to intervene. Lisa's expression briefly showed confusion, but then she turned away, leaving David to face Harris alone. Harris leaned closer, his voice lowering to a taunting whisper. "You think you're special just because you're wearing that uniform?" At that moment, David felt the clear disdain in Harris's words and actions. Yet, he stood still, clutching his military ID tightly in his hand, reminding himself, "Stay calm. Don't fight back. Don't let them win." Somewhere, a cruel challenge was about to begin. The atmosphere in the security area of Boston International Airport seemed to thicken as Officer Robert Harris stepped closer to David Thompson. Each heavy step, each sharp gaze from Harris felt like it was burning David. not just with scrutiny, but with unconcealed contempt. David stood still, his hand gripping his backpack and military ID. He said nothing, looking Harris straight in the eye with the calm determination of a soldier. But Harris seemed unable to tolerate that. To him, David's calmness was a challenge. "People like you," Harris emphasized each word, "always show up in places where you don't belong." That statement struck like a hammer blow to David's pride. He could hear the mockery and prejudice in every word. Something like fury began to smolder in his chest, but he remained still, shoulders squared and gaze unwavering. Harris didn't stop at words. He suddenly lunged forward, grabbing David's arm and shoving him hard into the wall. The unexpected, brutal action made David stumble, his back colliding with the cold wall. A deadly silence fell over the area. The eyes of passengers and other officers turned toward them, but no one moved. David took a deep breath, struggling to maintain control. He knew that reacting would only make the situation worse. As a seasoned soldier, he understood tense situations and how to stay calm under provocation. But this wasn't a battlefield, and Harris wasn't an enemy he was allowed to fight back against. "What the hell are you doing?" David said, his voice low and restrained, his eyes fixed on Harris. Harris smirked, as though he'd been waiting for that question. He lowered his voice so only the two of them could hear. "Don't play the victim with me, Thompson. You might fool the whole world with that uniform, but not me. I know your kind." Each word was like salt rubbed into David's wounds. He couldn't believe that someone wearing a badge of security could say such cruel and hateful things. But what hurt David more was the silence of those around him. Not far away, Lisa Parker, Harris's superior officer, stood with her arms crossed and a contemplative expression. She had witnessed the entire incident from start to finish but did not step in to intervene. Lisa, known for her voice in the airport security team, said nothing at that moment. There was something in Lisa's eyes, a hint of hesitation, a flicker of confusion, as if she was torn between intervening and letting things continue. Perhaps she feared that standing up for David would mark her as a troublemaker in a system that was already rotten and entrenched in prejudice. David glanced briefly at Lisa, a silent plea for help, but she only looked at him for a few seconds before turning away, her lips pressed tightly together. Around them, other security officers remained frozen like statues, saying nothing. Passengers passing through the checkpoint glanced over but quickly hurried away, as if afraid of getting involved in such a sensitive situation. That silence twisted painfully in David's chest. He had stood in the middle of war zones where everything was clear, friend or foe. But here, in the airport of the very country he had served and protected, the indifference of those around him was the most painful thing of all. Harris stood there, his face stone cold, though a flicker of discomfort flashed in his eyes. He was waiting for David to react, to lose his temper, to do something that would give him a reason to blame him. But David's incredible composure only seemed to agitate Harris further. "What's the matter? You're not going to fight back?" Harris sneered. "Or do you think that uniform will protect you?" David didn't respond. He simply stared at Harris, his gaze filled with disdain and disappointment. Harris felt like he was losing control of the situation. For someone like him, who thrived on overpowering others, not getting a reaction was unbearable. David stood tall, his back against the stark white wall. Harris loomed before him, shoulders tense with anger. Around them, Lisa Parker and the other officers remained silent, creating a heavy, stifling atmosphere. A thought rose in David's mind. Are they going to let him do this? Is no one going to say anything? The atmosphere in the security area remained suffocatingly heavy. David Thompson stood still, his resolute gaze fixed on Harris, who was determined to escalate the situation even further. The provocations and earlier acts of aggression seemed not to have satisfied Harris. In his mind, the hatred had transformed into a need to completely crush the calm image of the black soldier standing before him. Harris turned toward a group of security staff nearby and gestured with an air of authority. "He's refusing to cooperate and looks suspicious." The statement sounded like a prearranged signal. 3 security officers approached, their expressions hesitant but obedient. One of them spoke with reluctance. "Sir, please step into the private screening room." David clenched his fists and took a deep breath. He knew he had nothing to hide, but Harris's actions were turning a routine situation into a senseless pursuit. Amid the hundreds of people passing by, he felt like the center of attention, not met with sympathy, but with curious, distant, and judgmental stares. "I've complied with every regulation," David said, his voice low but patient. "I don't understand why I'm being treated this way." Harris smirked, his eyes gleaming with triumph as David was led into a small room behind the security area. It was a barren, cold room with gray walls and a metal table in the center. There was no one passing by. David sat down on the creaky metal chair, placing his hands on his thighs to steady himself. He felt like he was back in the days of combat, where every tense situation demanded absolute calm. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his homeland, where he should be treated with respect, not as a criminal. The sound of Harris's footsteps echoed in the small room. He entered, followed by Lisa Parker, whose expression remained unreadable. Harris planted his hands on the table, leaning toward David, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think that uniform makes you special? You think we can't touch you?" David lifted his head, his gaze calm but sharp. "I don't think anything. I just want to go home. But you've turned this into a manhunt." Harris let out a derisive chuckle and turned his head toward Lisa, who stood near the door with her arms crossed as if shielding herself. He lowered his voice, but it was still loud enough for David to hear. "People like him need to learn their place." Lisa's brow furrowed slightly. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face, but quickly vanished. She remained silent as though trapped in her internal conflict. Part of her wanted to speak up, but another part feared the consequences. David heard every word. A fire of anger flared within him, but he didn't let it show. As a soldier, he had learned to face provocation and hold back from impulsive actions. But this, being treated with contempt in the very country he had fought to protect, was hard to accept. "Learn my place?" David repeated, his voice trembling slightly from restraint. "What are you talking about?" Harris crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall as if savoring the moment. "People like you always try to prove something, always want special treatment. But here, I don't care who you are. Here, you're just someone we have the right to inspect." Lisa glanced at David again. She could see his patience being tested to its limit. She looked at Harris as if about to say something, but then fell silent again, held back by an invisible thread. Outside the room, a few officers began murmuring after hearing that David had been taken to a private room. A young staff member named Michael Scott stood quietly by the baggage conveyor belt. Michael had witnessed the entire incident, from Harris's provocations to the unreasonable escalation. His heart was filled with frustration and anger, but, like many others, he didn't dare speak up. Inside the room, Harris continued pacing around the table, his words chipping away at David's pride. "Are you carrying anything illegal? Don't think that uniform will make us overlook anything." David looked directly at Harris, his voice slow and clear. I served this country for 10 years. I'm not carrying anything illegal. If you want to inspect me, do it. But don't pretend this is a random search." Harris paused for a moment, then turned away, feigning impatience. Lisa, who by now seemed to have had enough, spoke to Harris in a low but firm voice. "Robert, that's enough. This isn't how we operate." Harris spun around, his sharp gaze cutting into Lisa, as though daring her to challenge him. "I'm following protocol. Do you have a problem with that?" Lisa said nothing. She knew that intervening now would mean facing repercussions from her superiors. But deep down, she couldn't deny the injustice unfolding before her. David remained seated on the cold metal chair, his gaze unwavering. Harris stormed out of the room, leaving Lisa standing there, looking conflicted and hesitant. Through the slightly open door, David could see a few security staff peeking in, but none of them said a word. A thought echoed in David's mind. How many more people will remain silent like this? The small room remained suffocatingly heavy with tension. David Thompson sat silently on the metal chair, his sharp eyes watching every move of Robert Harris, who was determined to push the situation further. To Harris, this was no longer a random search. It was a cruel performance to assert power and satisfy the hatred he hid beneath his security uniform. After Lisa Parker quietly left the room, Harris walked over to David's backpack, which lay on the table. He unzipped it deliberately, his movements slow and calculated, occasionally glancing at David to gauge his reaction. David observed, but said nothing, his instincts warning him that something was about to go wrong. Then, in a calculated act, Harris pulled an unfamiliar, old, but functioning phone from his coat pocket. With subtle skill, he slipped it into a small compartment of the backpack and zipped it back up. The action was so quick that only someone standing as close as David could have noticed. "Well, let's see here, soldier," Harris said, his voice drawn out and mocking. He lifted the backpack, pretending to have just discovered something. A smug smirk briefly flickered across his face. "Looks like we've found something suspicious." David immediately understood. He shot to his feet, his sharp gaze locking onto Harris. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but carried undeniable weight. Harris shrugged, holding the backpack as if it contained contraband. "I'm not doing anything. This phone was in your bag. Did you think I'd let you go without a thorough inspection?" David took a deep breath, maintaining his composure despite the anger burning inside him. He stared straight at Harris, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You think I'm going to believe this?" David said firmly. "I didn't bring anything like that. This is a setup, and I won't let you fabricate this story." Harris raised his eyebrows in mock surprise and turned toward a security officer who had just entered the room. "Call the rapid response team," Harris ordered with an authoritative tone. "We have a non-compliant suspect here." David's brow furrowed, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. He pointed a finger at Harris and declared with clarity, "I demand the surveillance cameras be reviewed. Everything you've done has been recorded. You won't be able to hide your actions." Harris immediately spun back around, his expression darkening and his smirk vanishing. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face at the mention of surveillance cameras. But, like someone well-versed in covering up wrongdoing, he responded calmly. "You think I need your permission to do my job? The cameras didn't catch anything, and you know it. People like you are always looking for a way to escape blame." David suppressed a sigh, the weight of helplessness pressing against him as he witnessed such blatant deceit and could do nothing about it. But what pained him more was the presence of the other security officers in the room. They saw, they heard, yet no one spoke up. Whether they feared Harris or were complicit with him, Their silence was deafening. "Sit down and wait," Harris said coldly. "We'll get to the bottom of this. Trust me, you're not going to like the outcome." David sat down slowly, his back straight, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. As a soldier who had faced death, he knew when to remain calm. But this was no battlefield. This was an invisible war, where the enemy used lies and dirty tactics instead of bullets to bring him down. The room fell into tense silence. Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, looking smug and satisfied. In his mind, the battle was already won. But he didn't realize one thing. The truth can never stay hidden forever. Outside the room, Lisa Parker leaned against the wall, clutching her tablet tightly. She had heard the entire exchange and felt a wave of guilt rising within her. Lisa knew exactly what Harris had done, but she lacked the courage to confront him. "What should I do?" she wondered, her contemplative gaze fixed on the closed door. Inside the room, David sat alone, the cold light casting shadows across his face, his eyes deep in thought. Outside, Harris basked in his victory, while Lisa remained frozen, torn between right and wrong. A clear thought echoed in David's mind. "I won't let them bury the truth. Justice will prevail." The small room where David Thompson was being held remained steeped in silence. Outside, Robert Harris appeared smug, as if he had won an unfair battle. But that silence was not the sign of an end. It was like a storm quietly brewing, ready to erupt. Not far away, Michael Scott, a young airport employee in a crisp new uniform, stood behind the glass wall of the security area. His eyes were locked on the room where David was being detained. Michael had seen it all. He had seen Harris deliberately provoke David. He had seen the suspicious phone being slipped into the backpack. It all happened right before his eyes, but Michael stood still, like a statue. He clenched his fists, his heart brimming with frustration and fear. "He's done something wrong. I have to say something," Michael told himself, but then the voice of fear echoed in his mind. "If I speak up, Harris will target me. I've only been working here for a few months. Is it worth risking my job?" The fear of retaliation, of losing his job, and of being ostracized kept Michael rooted in place. He lowered his head, avoiding the gaze of his colleagues, trying to hide the internal struggle raging within him. In another corner of the airport, Lisa Parker entered her private office and slammed the door shut. Inside, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of security footage replaying. Lisa held the tablet in her hands, her eyes glued to the screen where the video laid everything bare. From the moment Harris slipped the unfamiliar phone into David's backpack to the cruel insults he hurled, every detail had been captured without omission. Lisa buried her face in her hands, her heart tightening with guilt. "He's crossed every line," Lisa whispered. Throughout her years on the job, Lisa had heard about Harris's unfair behavior, but she had always told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. But today, for the first time, she felt like a part of the injustice. Her silence had enabled a blatant act of wrongdoing. She replayed the video over and over, her eyes conflicted. "If I expose this, Harris will be punished, but I'll have to face the consequences too. Am I ready for that?" Lisa leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. At that moment, old memories came flooding back. She remembered her first day wearing this uniform, vowing to uphold justice and fairness for everyone. Yet, over time, she had grown complacent, tolerating the wrongs around her for the sake of personal safety. Lisa's gaze gradually hardened with determination. "I can't stay silent anymore." Grabbing the tablet, Lisa stepped out of the room. Each step felt heavy, burdened by the weight of her decision. She knew that confronting Harris wouldn't be easy, He was someone who knew how to cover his tracks and retaliate against anyone who stood in his way. But this time, Lisa couldn't turn a blind eye. As she passed through the security area, her colleagues watched her with curiosity. Harris stood nearby, leaning against the control desk, his face calm as if nothing had happened. He looked at Lisa and smirked, as though challenging her. Lisa paused for a moment, gripping the tablet tightly. She knew that exposing this video could put her career at risk. But if she stayed silent, she would forever be part of the injustice. "Do it, Lisa," she told herself. "It's time to stand up." She turned and walked straight toward the Central Surveillance Office, where she could expose the truth without interference. On the screens, Harris continued to play the role of the model employee, but she knew his facade was about to collapse. David still sat in the cold room, his gaze thoughtful and unwavering. He didn't know that, outside, justice was beginning to stir. Lisa moved quickly down the hallway, her eyes alight with resolve. In her hands, the video evidence would change everything. Elsewhere, Michael Scott stood frozen, watching Lisa go, as though summoning the courage to step forward and join her. A storm was about to break. The small closed room where David Thompson was being held remained shrouded in an unsettling silence. He sat on the metal chair, his contemplative eyes fixed on the table. The cold light from the fluorescent lamp above cast a dull glow, making everything around him feel even darker. Harris had left, leaving David alone with his unspoken grievances and restrained anger. David clenched his military ID tightly in his hand, a reminder of all the sacrifices and dedication he had given. He recalled the days on the battlefield, where trust and camaraderie were the most precious things. But now, in his homeland, he was being treated like a stranger, like a criminal, just because of the color of his skin. Suddenly, at that moment, a thought flashed through David's mind. "I can't stay silent any longer. They can make me sit here, but they can't stop me from telling the truth." David stood up, pulling his phone from his pocket, one of the few possessions he had been allowed to keep. His hands trembled slightly with emotion, but his eyes burned with unshakable determination. He opened his social media and began to write. Each word felt like it was carved from his anger and courage. "Today, at Boston Airport, I, a soldier who has served this country for 10 years, was humiliated, falsely accused, and treated like a criminal just because of the color of my skin. I did nothing wrong, but that didn't stop someone in power from trampling on my dignity. I share this story not for myself, but for the millions of others out there, those without a voice, those who face injustice every day and have no one to stand up for them. Don't let injustice stay hidden. I will fight not just for myself, but for everyone who needs to be heard. Justice must be served." He attached a photo of his military ID, a clear affirmation of who he was and the honor he had built over his years of service. When his finger hovered over the Post button, David took a deep breath. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had nothing left to lose. This was how he would fight in a war without bullets, but filled with cruelty. At first, David's phone screen remained silent, but soon the notifications began to flood in. Likes, comments, and shares multiplied at a dizzying speed. His story had struck a deep, raw nerve in society, the pain of injustice and discrimination. "You're not alone. We stand with you. This needs to be exposed." The comment section overflowed with anger and empathy. David's story spread quickly beyond Boston Airport, becoming the center of attention on social media. Millions of people shared his post, demanding justice and transparency from the airport authorities. Hashtags like Justice for David, Jask End Injustice, and Voice of the Soldier began trending prominently. The entire country seemed to awaken to a reality many had chosen to ignore. Inside the airport, Michael Scott, the young employee, watched everything unfold on his phone. He stared at David's post in disbelief, feeling a wave of heat run through him as he read the words he knew were completely true. Michael looked around at his colleagues who were whispering and exchanging nervous glances. Some avoided eye contact, pretending not to care, while others appeared visibly uneasy. But Michael's eyes shone with something different, a spark of courage slowly taking form. In another corner, Lisa Parker sat in front of a computer screen in the surveillance office. She had seen David's post and watched as the story exploded like wildfire. The shares, the calls for justice, and the outcry from the community hit her like a blow to her conscience. He spoke up, so why haven't I? Lisa wondered. She looked down at the tablet in her hands containing the video evidence. Her heart pounded in her chest. It was time for her to decide. Would she remain silent, or would she stand up and reveal the truth? In the small room, David stared at his phone screen as the notifications continued to light it up. Thousands of messages of support and millions of shares ignited a flame of hope within him. He was no longer alone. His story had broken through the wall of lies Harris had built and reached the hearts of millions. Outside, Harris was still oblivious to the storm about to hit. Meanwhile, Lisa stood at a crossroads, clutching the video evidence, her eyes blazing with determination. A new battle had begun, and this time, David was no longer alone. The noise from the phone continued to ring out, notifications appearing relentlessly on the screen. David Thompson sat on the cold metal chair, his eyes fixed on the endless stream of social media activity. His post had gained nationwide attention, but this newfound notoriety was not entirely positive. Alongside messages of support and compassion, a wave of criticism began to rise like a ferocious tide. Some social media accounts wasted no time mocking, ridiculing, and even denying his entire story. He's just blowing this out of proportion. Wearing a uniform doesn't exempt him from being searched. He must be hiding something. This isn't about race. He's exploiting this story for attention. David read each comment, his heart tightening as though it was being squeezed. Those cruel words didn't just deny his experience, they turned him into a liar in the eyes of the public. Blowing this out of proportion. The phrase echoed in his mind like an invisible accusation. He couldn't believe that people would refuse to see the truth, that some would rather defend the perpetrator of injustice than listen to the victim. The pain deepened when David received a call from some of his former military comrades. The voice on the other end was sharper and colder than he expected. "David, what are you doing? Do you think this story is going to help you? You're embarrassing us, embarrassing the image of the military." David froze, his heart stopping for a moment. "Embarrassing the image of the military?" he whispered as if he couldn't believe his ears. The voice continued. "You know what we stand for: honor, duty, and loyalty. Taking this story to social media makes all of us look weak and divided. Have you thought about the consequences?" David gripped the phone tightly, anger and hurt swirling in his chest. The very people he considered family, the ones who had fought beside him, were now turning their backs on him and criticizing him for speaking out. "I didn't do anything wrong," David replied, his voice firm but laced with pain. "I'm not tarnishing the military. I'm fighting for justice, for the truth. This uniform isn't an excuse for me to stay silent in the face of injustice." "Oh, really?" his comrade scoffed. You've changed, David. Maybe you've forgotten what we stand for." The call ended, leaving David alone in the empty room. Those accusations weighed on him like tons of stone pressing on his shoulders. At that moment, he wondered whether he was doing the right thing. He had sacrificed his youth and strength to protect this country, and yet now he was being accused of betrayal for daring to speak the truth. David sat motionless, his gaze distant. Questions echoed in his mind. Should I keep going? Is this story worth sacrificing everything? Am I just making things worse? Images of his former comrades flashed through his mind. Men he had once saved on the battlefield. Men who had once called him brother. Now they had turned their backs and stood with the very people oppressing him. A wave of loneliness washed over him, drowning out all other thoughts. David looked down at the military ID in his hand. He remembered the grueling days of training, the sleepless nights on the battlefield, and the times he had risked his life to protect others. What had he been fighting for, he wondered, if this is how his country treated him now? In that moment of vulnerability, a new notification on his phone pulled him back to reality. It was a message from another veteran, someone he had never met. "I read your story, David. I've been through something similar, but I didn't dare to speak out. Thank you for standing up and fighting. You're not alone." David stared at the message, feeling a small light pierce through the darkness. Somewhere out there, people were waiting for him to keep fighting, people who had no voice and no courage to do what he was doing now. He took a deep breath and stood up. The storm had only just begun, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew that the truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. David walked over to the small window of the room, his eyes gazing at the gray sky outside. The criticism and betrayal had wounded him deeply, but they could not extinguish the fire burning in his heart. Outside, Harris remained smug, convinced that he had crushed David's spirit. But he didn't realize that pushing a soldier to his limits would ignite a strength that could not be stopped. David picked up his phone, opened his social media page, and typed a new post. "I know there will be critics and people who turn their backs on me, but the truth cannot be buried. I will keep fighting, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unjustly. This isn't just my battle. This is our battle." Outside, the community continued to rage. His story had spread far and wide, and now, despite the divisions, he knew he couldn't stop. Outside, the gray clouds loomed, signaling an impending storm. Inside the airport, the atmosphere was no better. A hidden wave was rising, and Robert Harris was completely unaware. What he believed to be his victory would soon turn into a nightmare. Lisa Parker sat alone in the central surveillance room, her eyes glued to the video playing on the screen. The footage captured everything in detail. Harris deliberately shoving David Thompson into the wall, planting the fake phone into his backpack, and the smug, mocking expression on his face as he falsely accused David. Each time she replayed the video, the guilt inside Lisa grew heavier. "Why did I stay silent for so long?" Lisa asked herself, her voice trembling as she paused the video. She could no longer sit still. The image of David, this soldier who had fought for his country, being humiliated like a criminal in his homeland, haunted her. Pushing aside her fear, Lisa decided to send the video to a major civil rights organization. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed send. A confirmation message flashed on the screen. Successfully sent. At that moment, Lisa exhaled in relief, though a vague sense of unease lingered in her chest. Things will never be the same again, but at least this time, I did the right thing. That evening, Lisa decided to take it a step further. She needed to meet David in person and tell him everything. They arranged to meet at a small cafe far from the airport. When Lisa entered, she saw David already sitting there, his face calm, but his eyes still carrying the weight of exhaustion. Lisa slowly sat down across from him. She looked up at David, her eyes filled with remorse. "Mr. Thompson," her voice faltered. "I was wrong for not standing up for you. I stood there, silent, when I should have done the right thing." David looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Finally, he nodded slightly, his voice calm but profound. "Why are you standing up now?" Lisa took a deep breath, clasping her hands together to hide her nervousness. "Because I can't live with myself if I stay silent any longer. I sent that video to a civil rights organization. The truth will soon come out. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." David looked at Lisa, sensing the sincerity in her words. He nodded, not as an immediate forgiveness, but as recognition that someone had chosen to step out of the shadows. "Thank you," David replied, his voice firm. "We can't change the past, but we can make it right." Lisa smiled faintly, as though a weight had been partially lifted from her shoulders, but she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, the storm truly broke. The video of Harris's misconduct was posted by the civil rights organization across all social media platforms. The footage of Harris shoving David into the wall and planting the fake phone became undeniable proof of his wrongdoing. Outraged, the public shared the video millions of times within hours. Comments erupted like fuel on a fire. "He's a security officer. That's shameful. David Thompson is a hero. Harris is the one who deserves punishment. We can't let things like this keep happening." Major news outlets quickly picked up the story. Television networks aired the footage repeatedly, calling it a prime example of abuse of power and racial discrimination. Boston International Airport found itself at the center of a public storm. The airport leadership was forced to issue a hasty statement, promising a full investigation and appropriate action. But for the public, that wasn't enough. They demanded Harris's immediate firing and criminal accountability. Meanwhile, at the airport, Robert Harris was in shock as the video spread everywhere. His face turned pale as colleagues looked at him with disgust and avoidance. Whispered voices echoed around him. Did he do that? He shoved a soldier into the wall. How could he be so heartless? Furious, Harris desperately tried to defend himself to those around him. The video doesn't tell the whole story. I was just doing my job. He deserved to be questioned. But this time, no one believed him. His facade had crumbled. Harris realized the situation was now beyond his control. David sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone screen. Messages of support and encouragement poured in relentlessly. One message stood out from Michael Scott, the young airport employee. "I saw everything that day. I'm ready to testify. You're not alone." David smiled faintly, feeling as though a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. The truth was beginning to come to light, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. Outside, the storm of public outrage only grew stronger. Harris's true colors had been exposed, and justice was finally beginning to find its way to the deserving. The storm of public outrage continued to roar, and Robert Harris knew his position was shaking violently. The video had exposed a truth he had never anticipated. But instead of backing down or admitting fault, his true nature emerged stronger than ever. Harris refused to accept defeat. He would strike back. The next morning, at an emergency meeting with the airport management board, Harris arrived exuding a false confidence. He began his plan to shift the blame onto those who had dared to destroy his perfect facade: Lisa Parker and Michael Scott. Standing before the officials, his face serious but his words dripping with deceit, he began, "I was only following proper security procedures. If there were any mistakes, it was because others on the team failed to do their jobs." As if rehearsed, he turned the spotlight onto Lisa. Lisa Parker failed to take control of the situation from the start. "The video everyone saw is incomplete. It's been edited. I was just doing my job, ensuring airport safety." Then he shifted to Michael Scott, the young employee who had offered to testify. Him, a new, inexperienced employee. I don't know why he would make such baseless accusations. The room fell into an oppressive silence. Harris believed he had regained control of the narrative, but he didn't realize the storm was far from over. Later that day, a public hearing was organized to uncover the full truth. Both Harris and David Thompson were summoned. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, a face-to-face confrontation between the accuser and the victim. As David walked into the room, the crowd outside chanted, "Justice for David! Harris must be punished!" Inside, Harris sat with arrogant composure, while David remained calm, his eyes radiating unwavering determination. When it was Harris's turn to speak, he clung to his same tired story, building his final wall of defense. "I was following protocol. I hold no bias against anyone. These accusations against me are unfounded and untrue." Finally, the hearing moderator called David to speak. The room fell silent, as though holding its breath. David stood before Harris, his gaze steady as he confronted him. "You say you were following protocol. Was planting that phone in my backpack protocol? Was shoving me into a wall and humiliating me in front of dozens of people protocol?" Harris shot David a provocative glare, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you're special just because you wear that uniform? You don't belong here." Harris's words cut through the silence like a knife. The room froze in shock, stunned by the audacity of his remark. In that moment, his true nature was laid bare for all to see. David took a deep breath, his voice calm but powerful as it rang through the room. "You're right. I'm not special. I'm no better than anyone, but I'm no less than anyone either. I've fought and sacrificed for this country so that others could live in peace and fairness. And yet, here you are, a man who should uphold justice, trampling on it." As David finished, the room erupted into murmurs and a wave of reactions. Many in the audience stood up and applauded, showing their support for David. Outside the hearing room, television networks began broadcasting the tense exchange live, and it quickly became a national focus. Social media exploded. "You don't belong here? I can't believe a security officer said that. David is a hero. Harris is a disgrace. He needs to be fired immediately. Don't stay silent against injustice. We must speak up." Harris had backed himself into a corner with no escape. His provocation hadn't just enraged the hearing room, it had sparked fury across the nation. After the hearing, Lisa Parker and Michael Scott stepped forward to face the swarm of reporters. Lisa no longer hesitated. Standing before the cameras, she spoke clearly. "I'm Lisa Parker. I witnessed the entire incident and stayed silent out of fear. But today, I will speak the truth. Robert Harris falsely accused and assaulted David Thompson. I have the video evidence, and I'm ready to testify." Michael Scott, though young, followed her lead with confidence. "I saw everything, and I won't stay silent anymore. Mr. Thompson did nothing wrong. It was Harris who deliberately provoked and abused his authority." Their words were the final blow to Harris's crumbling facade. The storm of justice swept away all the lies and cover-ups. David stepped out of the hearing room to the cheers of the crowd rallying behind him. Harris, in contrast, kept his head down, rushing out under the weight of disgusted stares. David walked with his head held high, his heart heavy but full of hope. He knew the fight wasn't over, but the truth had been revealed and justice was finally beginning to find its way back. Stepping out of the hearing room, David Thompson felt a fresh wave of air, as though the truth had finally begun to pierce through the darkness of injustice. But he knew one thing: this battle was far from over. His words and the evidence from Lisa Parker had exposed the true face of Robert Harris. Yet now David and his supporters would need to take this matter to court, a fight not everyone would dare to face. The very next day, the National Civil Rights Alliance, a prominent organization dedicated to justice and fighting discrimination, reached out to David. Their headquarters was home to experienced lawyers who had fought countless cases involving abuse of power and racial bias. In an office filled with documents and screens replaying the video evidence, David sat across from his team of lawyers. Claire Simmons, a veteran attorney renowned for defending victims of social injustice, placed her hand firmly on the table, her gaze resolute. "David, we believe you. What Harris did isn't just a case of abuse of power. It's an affront to human dignity, especially to someone who has served this country like you. We'll sue not only Harris, but also the airport management for enabling this behavior." David nodded, his voice calm but determined. "I don't want this to stop with me. They need to be held accountable, and this must never happen to anyone else again." Claire gave a small, confident smile, finding in David a resolve that couldn't be shaken. "All right. Then let's prepare for a long fight. We'll need evidence, witnesses, and everything possible to force them to bow before the truth." Amid the media storm, Michael Scott, the young airport employee, remained trapped in turmoil. He had witnessed the entire incident, from Harris's false accusations to his humiliating words, but fear had kept him silent. Sitting in his small apartment, Michael scrolled through social media comments. He saw people calling David a hero, but he also saw criticism claiming, "This is all exaggerated." Michael knew the truth and couldn't bear it any longer. Anger, guilt, and fear swirled inside him. Finally, he looked at himself in the mirror and told himself, "If I don't stand up now, how am I any different from Harris?" The next day, Michael called Claire Simmons and asked to meet David. When he entered the Civil Rights Organization's meeting room, his nervousness was evident, but his eyes shone with determination. "I'm ready to testify," Michael said, his voice shaky but firm. "I saw everything. Harris framed him, and I'll tell exactly what I saw." David stepped forward, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder, his gaze gentle yet resolute. "Thank you. This isn't easy, but you've done the right thing." Michael nodded, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. From this moment on, he would no longer be haunted by his silence. The next court hearing became a major event, closely followed by media outlets nationwide. The courtroom was packed, and outside, crowds rallied in support of David, holding banners high. "Justice for David Thompson. End abuse of power and discrimination." Harris sat at the defendant's table, his face retaining its cold composure, but his eyes betrayed clear anxiety. Across from him, David sat with his legal team, his shoulders squared and his gaze unwavering. Michael Scott was called to the witness stand. Taking a deep breath, he looked directly at the judge and jury. "I'm an airport employee, and I saw everything that day. Robert Harris shoved David Thompson into the wall without just cause. He planted a suspicious phone in David's backpack and then falsely accused him." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, whispers spreading throughout the space. David's lawyer displayed the video evidence to reinforce Michael's testimony. everything became crystal clear. Harris's lies unraveled, bit by bit. Claire Simmons rose, her voice sharp and resolute. "Your Honor, this is not just about one individual's abuse of power. This is about a system that has enabled such behavior for far too long. Today, we fight not just for David Thompson, but for the thousands of others who have been victims of injustice but had no voice." Harris sat silently in the defendant's chair, sweat beading on his forehead as he realized everything was collapsing around him. Michael Scott's testimony, the video evidence, and the relentless public pressure had pushed him to the brink of downfall. Outside the courthouse, David stepped out to cheers from the crowd. He looked up at the deep blue sky, his heart filled with determination. He knew this fight wasn't over, but today they had taken a monumental step forward. Justice had begun to rise, and he wouldn't stop until everyone was treated with the fairness and respect they deserved. The courtroom lights seemed brighter as the judge stepped onto the bench, lightly tapping the gavel against the table to signal for silence. Everyone held their breath, awaiting the final verdict. David Thompson sat upright, his hands clenched tightly, his gaze fixed on Robert Harris, who now sat devoid of the arrogant confidence he once exuded. The judge read the court's decision, each word clear and resolute. The defendant, Robert Harris, is found guilty of abuse of power and engaging in racial discrimination against the plaintiff, Sergeant David Thompson. The court orders Harris to be held accountable under the appropriate legal statutes. The courtroom erupted into cheers from the crowd. David's supporters stood up, applauding incessantly. Outside the courthouse, the crowd holding banners that read, "Justice has prevailed," chanted triumphantly. Robert Harris sat frozen at the defendant's table, his face pale and expressionless. The mask of deceit and arrogance he had hidden behind had completely crumbled. A court officer approached him, instructing him to leave the courtroom under escort. Harris glanced at David one last time, but this time there was no defiance in his eyes, only bitterness and defeat. David stood, quietly watching Harris as he was led away. There was no gloating, no satisfaction. For David, this was not a personal victory but a triumph for justice and the truth. Immediately after the court's verdict, the leadership of Boston International Airport held an urgent press conference. The spokesperson, with a serious expression, addressed dozens of cameras and journalists. "We extend our deepest apologies to Sergeant David Thompson and the community for the serious failures that have occurred. We acknowledge our responsibility and commit to implementing broad reforms to ensure this never happens again." In their official statement, the airport leadership announced the immediate termination of Robert Harris with a declaration that he would never again be permitted to work in the security field. Mandatory anti-discrimination and anti-abuse training for all airport security personnel. A reform of security protocols to ensure transparency and fairness, and 2. Prevent any abuse of power. Installation of additional transparent surveillance systems and the creation of a hotline for passengers to report misconduct. The news spread across the nation, hailed as a significant step in the fight against injustice. Media outlets described it as the consequence of courage and highlighted David's role in exposing the truth and forcing change within a long-protected system. David stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by the warm glow of the afternoon sun. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of an enormous burden lifting from his shoulders. Lisa Parker and Michael Scott walked up to him. Lisa looked at him with genuine sincerity. "Thank you for not giving up. You've taught me something important. Staying silent in the face of injustice is enabling it. I will never make that mistake again." Michael smiled faintly. though his eyes still reflected the emotion of the moment. "You showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's standing up even when you know the risks." David turned to them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders, his voice firm and trusting. "We did the right thing, not just for me, but for everyone who doesn't have a voice. Truth and justice need people like us to protect them." As David stepped out of the courthouse area, the crowd erupted in cheers to welcome him. He looked around and saw not just people of color, but individuals of all races and backgrounds standing together, united in their belief in justice. "This is a victory for all of us," he thought, "a testament that the truth can never be buried and that justice will always find its way back." That evening, David sat alone in his small apartment. He gazed out the window at the calm, peaceful night sky. His phone vibrated with countless messages of gratitude and encouragement from people across the country. "Thank you, David. You've given us hope. Justice prevailed because of you." David set the phone down and smiled. This battle had taught him a profound lesson. The courage of one person can ignite hope for an entire community. When we stand together, no injustice can endure for long. After his court victory, David Thompson's life turned a new page. He was no longer just a soldier returning from the battlefield or a victim of injustice. He had become a symbol of justice and unwavering determination. David's name appeared across media platforms as an inspiring story of courage and a relentless fight against injustice. Civil rights organizations invited him to speak at major events where thousands listened to his story and found hope. One morning, David entered the Security Officer Training Academy. He stood before hundreds of young cadets, soon to be guardians of community safety. Their eyes were fixed on him, admiring, curious, and expectant. David took a deep breath, his voice calm yet powerful. "Today, I stand here not to criticize you, but to remind you of the sacred responsibility you carry. When you wear this uniform, you take on the duty of protecting people and upholding justice, not of destroying their trust." The auditorium fell silent, hanging on his every word. David continued, his gaze sweeping across the young faces. "Never let prejudice cloud your judgment. Never allow power to turn you into someone who abuses it. Remember this: every person you encounter in this life deserves respect, regardless of their skin color or background." A thunderous round of applause erupted, echoing endlessly. The young cadets stood, looking at David with newfound admiration. They knew the man standing before them had endured a grueling battle, not on a distant battlefield, but here, at home, where he had to fight to be seen as an equal human being. David began dedicating much of his time traveling across the country, visiting schools, conferences, and small communities. He shared his story, not to recount his pain, but to inspire change. He met young people who had faced discrimination, people like him who had been silenced and treated unjustly. One afternoon, David stood on the stage of a major social justice forum. Thousands of people sat before him, but his voice remained humble and sincere. "I am not a hero. I'm just an ordinary man who stood up when I realized I could no longer stay silent. But do you know something? Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us, from the smallest voices, from the bravest actions in our daily lives." The audience fell silent for a moment, then rose in unison, applauding. Many wiped away tears. They weren't just hearing a story. They were witnessing a glimmer of hope, a reminder that everyone can contribute to the fight against injustice. Late one night, David stood on the balcony of his small apartment, gazing at the quiet night sky. The city lights shimmered in the distance like thousands of small flames, each one representing someone ready to stand up for truth and justice. He thought back to that first day at Boston Airport when he simply wanted to return home to his family after 6 months away. Who could have imagined that day would change his life forever? The pain, humiliation, and anger that once threatened to overwhelm him had now become the driving force for something greater. David smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting unshakable conviction. He whispered to himself, as though making a promise to the future, "This is just the beginning. I won't stop. One day, future generations will live in a fairer world, a world where people are seen for who they truly deserve to be." The image of David standing there, looking toward the distant horizon, closed the story with an open ending full of hope. His journey didn't end here. It had only just begun. David Thompson's story is not just a fight for justice, but a call to action, reminding us all that we can create change if we dare to stand up for what is right. What do you think of David's actions? If you were in his shoes, would you have the courage to speak up like he did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos.